Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is a Cold Steel Warrior Series Katana. It's a sword that I've been asked to review a number of times, and I'm glad I have an example now to do that with. Before I get into it, though, a couple caveats that you should know before I get into the nitty-gritty of the review, as I often do. First, this is a second-hand sword, which means it may not be representative of what you would expect to get if you were to buy one new from Cold Steel or an authorized distributor. Now, I actually bought this from sword friend Arthur, who happens to be Mr. Excalibur. If you haven't seen his channel, I'll put a link in the description down below. He's going to make his own review on this one, as well as we're going to kind of convene afterwards, hopefully, and have a conversation about our mutual thoughts on the same example of sword. And so I will put links to those videos along with Weapon Dynamics computer and specs about this particular one in the description down below for you to consume if you are so inclined. Also, note that I do study Japanese swordsmanship. I'm not particularly good at it. I'm not an expert in swordsmanship, and so keep that as well in mind as you hear my musings and ramblings. This is just my personal thoughts and observations, and I'm a hobbyist, not an expert. Very important to know. One additional bit that's worthy of noting is that I do have some bias when it comes to Cold Steel. I'm not a big fan of some of their business practices and of some of their products. And I've actually had a few of these Cold Steel Warrior Katanas in the past, and let's just say I have some sour grape feelings about them. I'm not a particularly big fan. Going into this, I'm not expecting to like this sword, and I think that's worthy of noting right at the get-go. I'm going to do my best to be fair and objective and try to explain why I think what I think, and hopefully it provides some context and information to you, but you should know that I'm not expecting to like it. I'm expecting to really not like it, in fact. And if I'm being too unfair, if I'm being not objective, then call me out in the comments down below if I'm not. I'm going to try to be, but if I fail, throw it down there in the commentary. Anyway, on with the actual review. Alright, so what is this sword supposed to do? Well, Cold Steel advertises it doing some pretty audacious things, you might say. So it's supposed to be a pretty durable, fun thing to chop around with. I don't know how specific it is to use for Japanese swordsmanship or practicing or something like that, but as a chopping device, it's supposed to be quite effective at it. Now, Cold Steel sells it for close to $600 on their website, but like many other mass production or vendors out there that charge a higher MSRP, you can go to an authorized distributor like Athena and buy them for around $300. So as I look at it, I'm going to figure that you can buy a new one of these for around $300, and that's kind of the price point in my mind as I evaluate if I think it's worth it or not. That's kind of going to be the price ballpark that I'm considering it, rather than the MSRP of around $600. You can find one new for $300, or you can go spend more money if you want and spend $600. That's not much different than buying something from CS Siberia or Hanwei directly versus going to Cold Athena and getting it for a significant discount off that MSRP. Alright, the first thing I want to start with is the Kashira, the pommel, the end cap here. And actually the first thing I want to start out with is that it's good. And I know I said it'd be a bit of a negative Nancy here, but I'm not going to be. I actually like the execution on this, and I like the theme. Those are two things that are going to run through kind of the remainder of the fittings. They all have a similar level of fit and finish, but I'll elaborate them in ad nauseum as I often do. Anyway, what you see is this kind of Yumi arrow, or Yumi's a bull. Anyway, arrowheads, Japanese style arrowheads. And I'd like to say that the casting quality on this, even having used this mold what must have been a bajillion times by now, since this is a pretty prolific sword and it's been made a lot, this casting is still quite detailed. I can make out all the little details that I need to, but at the same time, it's not so crisp that it's sharp. You would think some of these pointy bits on here would be uncomfortable. That hasn't been the case. I've been practicing with this sword for a couple weeks now, and nothing about this has bit me or been uncomfortable as a user from a user perspective. It does have these cast-in shitodome here. This would be the little washer where the knot goes through, and these are cast in, but there's no sharp ledges or anything like that. Where the transition meets, it's also not bunched up. The transition is actually pretty good. There is a slight ledge here, but nothing that is uncomfortable from a user perspective, snags your skin, or bites into you at all. Overall, it's pretty well done. The Kashira is on there pretty tight too. And I do have to say, I just like the aesthetic of this particular fitting set. It's one of my favorite from Cold Steel. I like this kind of simple arrowhead design. I do think it's crisp and clean and overall well executed. It's not overly crazy or anything like that, but again, a $300 sword, I think this is an excellent execution of a Kashira on a sword of this price point. Now I'm actually going to move on to the ska at the handle, and first I'm going to start with the shape. Now the Cold Steel doesn't really have any kind of wasting or anything like that in the shape. It's pretty straightforward, but it is worth pointing out its maybe closest competition, and here I have a Hanwei Musashi XL, which is, well, similar in price but a bit different, and it's just a representation of the Hanwei thicker skas. Now at a glance they don't necessarily have a huge amount of difference, but if I stick them in this other camera here and push to the side, hopefully you'll be able to see, basically the Hanwei probably looks a little thicker here, and if I turn them to the side, maybe a little thicker on this side as well. And it's just those little bits that start to add up, this extra little circumference or diameter or whatever it happens to be, that makes the hanwei feel just a little too big for most people's hands, myself included. Now to that end, while the Cold Steel is not giving any kind of wasted shape or particularly interesting shape, it certainly feels comfortable in the hand. I don't have a problem indexing it, and the circumference or size isn't problematic. This is known to be a pretty big and beefy sword, but I don't find the handle particularly problematic to hang on to, at least in general shape. Matt from the future here. So, quick note, I have tried taking this handle off. I removed the pegs and then tried actually hammering the ska off this handle part, which is typically held in by these two pegs. I beat the Tsuba with a hammer, at least as much as I was comfortable doing before it got bent or anything, and really no movement at all in the Tsuba. So, it seems on there pretty tight, which is a mixture of good and bad. So if you never plan on taking apart a sword, which I would suspect that many people in the $300 buying price category of a sword would never intend on doing, then it's on there tight and it's going to withstand some hammer hits, and it's not something that should come loose over time, at least not this example. That said, if you are a person that intends on taking it apart to clean it, to maintain it, to sharpen it, to whatever it happens to need to be done that would involve taking the handle off, well, I would say it's not going to be an easy task. Not that it's impossible, but in this particular example, it seems like it's not going anywhere. If I move on to the ito, it has this black silk ito, and you can see that the way it's wrapped, the diamonds kind of go all over the place. Now, they do appear to alternate, but they run the gambit in terms of shape and size. Overall, though, they're actually pretty tight, and this another thing I have to give some credit here. I haven't always had them be tight, but this particular example is reasonably tight. Reasonably tight, by that I mean I can move it around. If I push hard with my finger, I do get it to move, but it's hard. It's a little softer in some spots, but overall, this I would say is tight enough that it's going to hold up to usage, doesn't make me nervous using it, and gives me the impression that it's going to hold up for quite a while. Especially after a couple weeks of use, nothing is loosened up and the Kashira is still on there pretty tight. So I think in terms of functionality, it's fine. I can also make out little hishigami, little paper triangles underneath the ito here. If I push this around, I can actually make out the ledge of the Samegawa panel on here too. If I talk about the Samé, the white substance underneath here, it appears to be real, but it's all very small ray skin. It's all teeny tiny stuff, not particularly interesting or unique or special. That said, again, sword in the $300 range. I'm not particularly expecting anything grandiose, but it's worth noting that sometimes on a $300 sword you'll see larger nodules than this, and if that's something you care about, it's worth knowing that these, or at least this particular example, is small. The Menuki on here, again, I like that they aren't raised up substantially. Sometimes Menuki will be big and they'll push this up a couple millimeters, and that means that when your fingers are resting on here, it feels like it wants to break your grip slightly, and that isn't the case here. They're pretty flat. They have this nice long arrowhead here that seems to be as well cast as the Fuchi, Kashira, and Tsuba are, and I like the execution on the Menuki. I like the style overall. Now I'll talk about the Fuchi, this collar up here, and the Fuchi is not as quite as well suited or seated as the Kashira is. There's a slight ledge here that you can make out where the ito is overlapping. That's not ideal. The other transitions inside seem to be pretty good though. It's really just this, and I can't say that it's sharp or problematic from a user perspective. Also, if you look at the transitions, please skip the crack for now. You can note that they line up reasonably well. It's not the best, but it's certainly not the worst, and there's nothing jarring, at least visually. All right, now I'm going to tell you about the Tsuba, and I think the Tsuba is a pretty smart design here. It has this raised rim, which aesthetically I like the look of, but it also means I'm not expecting this pattern to flow over the edges, and that must make it a little easier and less expensive to cast. And I think these cutouts, along with these raised portions, overall casting quality seems pretty good, and design seems pretty good. I like that there's consistency in the theme here. It's just arrowheads everywhere. And while that might be a contemporary, kind of modern thing, maybe you do or don't like it. Don't get me wrong, I like a Japanese sword that tells a story, but sometimes I get lost. There's examples of swords that I've seen made that tell a story, and I just don't understand it, and it seems like a hodgepodge of pieces that go together until I read and study more. And if that's not something you're into, then well, I suppose it might not be for you. This is arrowheads. It's all over the place. It's simple, and I'm a simple guy. I put swirly mitsudomes on everything rather than arrowheads, but I can appreciate the kind of contemporary simplicity. Anyway, I'm going to just say I like the theme, I like the execution, I like the design overall. I also want to point out, again, from a practitioner standpoint, these little ledges in here, I was kind of expecting one of my chubby fingers would get caught in them or snag somewhere. That hasn't been the case. I've tried choking up on the Tsuba, and nothing bites me. There's no discomfort, which I was kind of expecting with some of these ledges. But even as I run my finger across them, none of them seem to really bite in. They seem sanded down or tampered enough to not cut in. Overall, I think it's a handsome execution. The Tsuba is pretty tight. Functionally, I think it does the job, and aesthetically, I think it's actually pretty good. If I talk about the habaki, very simple brass habaki here. Nothing really to write home about. It's not ill fit or anything, at least in the realm of $300 swords. It seems to be on there pretty secure and fit reasonably well given, again, its price point. Now I'm going to talk about the saya, and there's a few more things to talk about here. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that is these cracks along the saya. There's actually 3 of them. There's a pretty sizable one here you can make out that has chipped the lacquer, and then there's 2 along the back. The cracks are pretty substantial and obviously a pretty big concern. Now, supposedly, sword friend Arthur said that when he got this sword, these cracks existed on the sword. And Cult of Athena notes as much that cracks and scuffs and things like that are pretty commonplace when it comes to cold steel, so much so that they don't really consider them abnormal now and aren't really cause to return it. So if this would be unacceptable to you, I don't know if this is necessarily something that they would say is minor or not, but to me this seems pretty bad. It's obviously aesthetically very unpleasing and something that could be a great concern as time goes on and it ages. Aside from that, the glaring obvious crack, there are some positives to talk about saya-wise. One, the tension is actually quite good. It comes off with a slight push of the thumb. It doesn't fall out even with a little bit of jiggle, and the saya doesn't rattle extensively. It will if I shake it hard enough, but not really a lot. Overall, I think the saya is actually pretty good, except for these cracks. Now, I'm pretty sure it's just that it wasn't tensioned right. Supposedly the saya ships separately, and by that I mean the sword isn't shipped in the scabbard. So how it cracks, I guess I don't exactly really know. It seems like Cold Steel's probably taken attempts to mitigate the cracking, but it still seems to happen. The point is, though, that if it cracked prior to the sword being put in, it doesn't seem like it was too tight, but obviously with the tension being about right, if I were to glue the saya shut now, then I might glue the sword in the saya, or it might be problematic to fix. If I take it out and clamp it and use wood glue, it might be too tight and split again. This is something that could be fixed. It's just not something that you should have to fix. As it is, though, the tension seems about right, and that's I suppose a positive thing, but it wouldn't be something I would trust to hold up for a long time. Over time and usage, these cracks are going to expand. The wood will expand and contract with humidity and temperature, and it's probably going to loosen up in such a way that it is no longer tight at all. And as it's already cracked, it could become dangerous or even harder to fix. Anyway, this is something that is no good, something unacceptable out of the box. Now, I don't know if the camera's picking it up here, but you might be able to see what looks like little dots. And basically, the ito is tied in a presentation knot, and I'm suspecting the lacquer was not completely dry and it's left an indentation. This might be able to be cleaned up with an application of like Mother's Mag or some sort of polish, like auto paint polish or something. Sometimes gets these things out. Again, not something you should have to do, but at least this is quite a bit more common. Very often you'll find these things if you untie the knot, the lacquer just wasn't quite dry and has left some minor imprints. Now, I don't know how many of these scratches were on the paint when Sword Friend Arthur got it, but these kind of scuffs, I suppose, are really par for the course. Some of these are pretty big, but again, you could clean them up with some sort of polish or something like that. You could potentially buff these out, so to speak. That said, I don't think you should have to. It should come in better shape than this, especially since you can buy $100 swords that have better packaging and don't seem to come like this. Now, one thing I do like about the saya is it comes with a metal kojiri. That's this end cap at the end of the saya, and obviously metal can be a little bit more durable than horn, at least it can be in some cases. This one has a slight ledge, but the overall finish quality is about the same as the rest of the fittings in that I think it's actually quite good. And I like the metal kojiri. Now, you can see that it's got a little ding here. That's from me. I've been practicing outside on concrete, and I do a type of seated EI, or a type of seated kata, and sometimes if you draw the sword, the tip of it bangs into the ground, and that's unfortunate, but something that is chipped in the past. Horn kojiri areas are chipped just paint, so this metal one is at least a little bit more durable and will hold up marginally better to that type of usage, which is appreciated. I also just like the overall aesthetics. One other thing I like about the saya is that it does make some attempt at tapering. It gets gradually thinner as it gets towards the end. Now, oftentimes these swords at around $300 are a metal tube, and they don't have any dimension. This one does, and it's appreciated. That said, again, the big glaring crack is the main thing about the saya that's not particularly nice. The sword also came with a Sageo. It's this one, and it's a pretty cheap and inexpensive Sageo. I don't think too highly of it, but that said, Sageo is relatively inexpensive. It can be very expensive, but you can get them for $12-15 that are more suited to your personal preference and are also more suited to the size that you might need. Some people like long, some people like short. The manufacturer can never guess exactly what you're going to need. Anyway, not a big deal, but it's worth noting it's not a particularly fancy Sageo. This Kurigata here appears to be wood, and I like that it didn't come with these shitodome pieces, these kind of brass washers that are in here that always fall out and come loose and end up scratching everything up. If you're not going to do it well, don't do it at all, and that's the approach they took here. Overall, the Kurigata is fine. It's also placed about right. You can kind of see roughly where it is, and it seems to be about in the right position for usage. The last thing to note here is that the Koiguchi area here is pretty wide, and as I do note, I find it very easy to kind of be off center and jam the tip in. Even pretty deep, I can kind of snag the tip in here, and it just gives some pause when I'm doing no tone. It can be a little bit uncomfortable. That's me as a practitioner struggling with it. If I were better with my angles, it would be good, but I do notice that I tend to snag the tip in the kind of meat or the wood of the saya more than I do with other swords. It could be because it's heavier or got an okazaki on it, I'm not exactly sure, but just an observation I noted from usage. Last bit about the saya, I promise, it's just worth noting that it's noisy. Alright, now I'm going to tell you about the blade, the pointy stabby part. First thing to note, this is a big blade, big and imposing looking, and I'll put specs in the description down below, and I'll talk about dynamics in just a moment. But suffice to say, this is a pretty thick blade at the base, pretty wide as well, and it's actually wider and thicker at the Kasaki, right at this Yokota area, this transition to the tip, than many swords are at the base, or just above the habaki. It has a pretty shallow Sori for its size, but deep enough that it has some curvature, and it has some simple aesthetic embellishments. So if I go here, you can see that there is a Kasaki area. This Yokote looks at least reasonably well defined. Now granted, it's just sanded another way. This is not a very aesthetically pleasing polish, but it is at least some attempt at an aesthetic embellishment, which I appreciate. It also has very crisply terminated bohi, which are nice. I like that, and they're terminated in the same spot. Again, a positive. One other note I want to point out here, something that is often missed, is you can see that this tip has like a slight swelling just before the edge of the tip. So it's thinner here, and then kind of swells out towards the tip. And that's something that's often missed in $300 swords. It's very common to see these just be flat. Seeing this kind of swollen tip area or this reinforced area on the tip is something I appreciate seeing. The bohi as well as the combination of the tip make a pleasant wind sound if you have any semblance of edge alignment. And so, as a user, it offers some ease of use in that regard, and that it's at least a noisy sword and easy to get those wind sounds. Now, also, as you're looking at the sword, these markings, these silver things, are me. I put some Sharpie on the sword as I was looking for the nodes and such while I was doing the weapon dynamics computer, and this just is an aid for me to do that, and I didn't clean them up before doing the review. But I will revisit that. Anyway, suffice to say, though, the rest of the blade is pretty simple. This is supposed to be a through-hardened mono steel, and I don't remember exactly what steel it is, 1050, 1055, something like that. A relatively lower carbon content steel on the grand scale of things, but it's also through-hardened and made to be just a durable, resilient sword. It also has kind of a satin polish on it, so if you're using it, it's going to be a little harder to get scuffs and things like that in, and it's going to be easier to clean up if you are so inclined to do that. The surfaces are relatively flat. They're not perfect, and their bohi has a lot of rippling. The bohi is also pretty wide, but the surfaces are overall reasonably good for a sword like this. Aesthetically speaking, though, it doesn't have a lot of embellishments. It's a modern kind of steel, and it's through hardened, so you don't have a hamon. They made no attempt to wire brush or etch one on, which I actually like, and there's no hata, it's not folded steel. But minus those aesthetic embellishments, you get something that is at least imposing looking and easy to maintain and care for, and if you're going to use, is not as likely to get diminished in terms of condition, and maybe even a little easier to bring back to the condition that it's in right now. Anyway, in terms of usage, I have to note that this is giving me kind of mixed feelings, and this is kind of where I have to question my own bias. I did not have fun using the previous swords. They reminded me, when I was coming into this review, of a big dumb dead crowbar, and I didn't like them at all. And this is not that. It doesn't get an F- in terms of dynamics, but I honestly don't know how the dynamics are working. I have to question if I take the measurements right, because this does not feel like a 2-pound, 9-ounce sword. It feels heavier than that. It feels I would suppose dynamically inferior to many other swords. It's big and imposing and has a lot of kind of forward tip movement, and this is where I don't know if it's just my bias, because the math doesn't line up with what I feel in my hand. This feels like a cumbersome sword to move around. Not so bad that it's unwieldy, or not so bad that I couldn't control it, but it's a little rough, especially in one hand. The silk is smooth enough that it kind of slips my grip a little bit, and that might be why it skids off the bottom of my palm. I can feel it not stay rested in one hand. So any kata that I'm doing where I have one-handed draw cuts, it kind of moves around, and I find it difficult to control. With two hands, it's not so bad. I feel like I have control over it, but at the same time, it's tough to get tip speed moving, and it also feels cumbersome to stop. But at 2 pounds 9 ounces is not actually a particularly heavy sword. So 2 pounds 9 ounces is just a little bit above medium, to be on the medium heavy side. But there are certainly swords that are much heavier than this, and it just feels heavier than it should in the hand. So dynamically, I don't particularly like it, and in terms of moving it, I find it cumbersome in one hand. But it is controllable, and that brings me to cutting. Now, when I did some cutting, I took water bottles and things like that, and the edge is basically just insufficient for the targets that I'm cutting. I would notice chunks of stuff left over, and this sword was used for cutting a little bit prior to coming to me, and it feels sharp-ish, but still there would be residue of paper and things like that after cutting bottles. It didn't really cut the bottles particularly well. It cut them, but not, I would say, particularly well, and I found it sometimes difficult to maintain control. In the brief bit of cutting, and obviously I whacked it right on the neck there, did all right. A quick round of water bottles, and basically I'm seeing an edge that seems perfectly sufficient to cut water bottles, though obviously my technique and the edge here are not really sufficient to leave the bottle really standing or to pass through without causing enough commotion to knock it off the stand or being disruptive in that regard. That said, it is cutting through the bottles. I'm giving it in some cases a lot of chutzpah, and in other cases not. And either way, despite the lack of keen edge, it's doing a reasonably good job. Obviously, there's some debris or some extra paper left on from cutting the cream container, but for what it is, the overall edge sharpness on this particular example seems perfectly sufficient to do general backyard shenanigans. In terms of cutting used Japanese tatami, it didn't do particularly well. I had to really throw it out there. I had to really give it a lot of gusto to make it through the tatami mat. And again, some cases there would be strands kind of stuck that looked like they got pushed through the mat rather than cut. So I'm not overly enthusiastic about the cutting. I did note that I've had some previous experience with the Hanwa, or with the Cold Steel Warrior Katana. I've had them before, and this one doesn't feel the same. As I recall, I had them and they felt big and dumb and stupid in my hand, and this does not. Well, it's not my favorite. It's certainly not a crowbar. And in my research, I was able to find other people's reviews. This one weighs 2 pounds 9 ounces, which seems to be on the much lighter side. Other swords have weighed at 2 pounds 15 ounces. That's almost half a pound more than this sword weighs right here. And effectively, the Fuchi, Kashira, and Menuki and all of that kind of stuff are cast and likely of the same material, so I'm doubting that they've changed much. The handles seem about the same size, and I don't think the wood is more dense or would account for that kind of weight, so it must be some lightening in the blade. Now this feels much better than it has in the past, and I recall that's because the other ones felt like a big dumb dead crowbar. Perhaps the newer iteration is lighter and more refined than the previous generation, or perhaps this one's just an oddity and one of the more refined examples that are out there. Anyway, I can't say for certain. I can say though that this particular one, the one I have to review in my hand, is not terrible. It's not bad, but I would still describe it as not particularly fun. And I think a big part of that has to do with the slipperiness of the grip, and while I like the shape of the grip, it just doesn't feel as connected in my hand for a blade that's weighted this way as others would. It's also worth noting that, hopefully you're able to see kind of where my thumb is here. It's also worth noting, maybe you can see this little bit right here. Now, sword friend Arthur mentioned that he was cutting with this sword before and that the edge diminished a little bit on the top of a bottle. It's worth noting that I did a lot of bottle cutting and I did whack it into the top of bottles and the edge didn't suffer any other damage. This was here prior to me doing any cutting, but it does bring into question how well the heat treatment was done if it did nick on a bottle. That said, again, I cut a lot of bottles and I didn't have any other edge problems. It seems about as sharp as it was when I started. Anyway, the end all be all is just not sharp enough. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to take this sword, I'm going to sharpen again. Now at $300 for a sword that's wide and, you know, like this, it's not crazy to think that you might have to sharpen it. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to make an attempt at sharpening it, and then I'm going to try a couple more bottle cuts. I'm going to try the Tommy cut again, and I'm going to see if the results are different. Now hopefully there will be a sharper sword. It's probably going to cut better, and this looks like it has the edge profile to take a keener edge and hold it reasonably well, but we'll see. Anyway, that's the next step that I'm going to do. So far, I'm not impressed with usage. I'm not impressed with the cutting. It feels a little cumbersome, but I like some of the features. It's a cool looking sword. The Ito's tight. They've gotten some of the boxes that other people miss, but they certainly miss some of the things that we take for granted, like not having a cracked sai or not slipping out of your hand when you're holding it with one hand. Anyway, those are my thoughts thus far. I'm going to move on to sharpening the sword, and then I'm going to take another couple whacks at cutting. Alright, so a brief description of what I did in order to sharpen this blade. Basically, I took it to a 600 grit belt. I have a 1x30 inch belt sander, which is kind of a Harbor Freight special $50 belt sander, if you will. I took it to the 600 grit belt that I have, and then a 1000 grit belt, and then a leather strap with jeweler's rouge. And I was so impressed by my work that I actually did it all over again because I wasn't actually impressed by my work. And I'm not honestly very proud of this example here. It took a little doing, and you can see that there are a lot of aesthetic imperfections that are now present in the blade. Sharp as it is, there's a lot of marring and scuffing on the blade that wasn't there before. That said, I got the blade much sharper. I'm much happier with the overall level of sharpness. In terms of sharpness, bear in mind I'm really terrible at this paper cutting nonsense. I would say it's sufficiently sharp. It's now sharp enough to, yes, shave. So it is shaving sharp. Oh, I gotta clean that. So how did it perform after I did the sharpening? Well, it performed much better, as you would hope and expect. And to its credit, I was able to do some relatively low distance cutting and execute on that. It didn't look like it was pushing material through anymore, and it was much easier to cut with. I was able to control the blade more because I didn't have to really throw it out there with so much gusto. So I was able to generate some tip speed, move through the targets, and I was happy with the results. Namely on the tatami cutting, I was able to cut through Japanese tatami mat, the same type of mat, soaked in the same type of water. And basically I was able to throw it out there, cut through the mat, and then stop the blade in such a way that my blade would be between me and my target. I didn't have to overswing so much. Now, I would still say dynamically it's not fun to move around, but I'll talk about that in a minute. It's controllable though, and so when I say that the blade is dynamically inferior or less fun to move around, know that it's still certainly wieldable. As I can attest to, I was able to cut through and still stop the blade, control it, albeit a not fun experience. It's still certainly possible. Alright, sword friends, you might ask, what the hell is that? Well, those are pants full of long clippings. Pants, in fact, that I've tried to hit other swords with and unsuccessfully cut. I have no idea how effective a test this is, probably not at all. But it does give me an idea of how well this sword cuts fabric, I suppose. And tatami mats aren't but long clippings, if you will. I've keened this edge up. It's pretty sharp, so we'll see how well it does. Well, it's substantiated that they are in fact full of long clippings, and I did just poke right in the dick. That was very nice. Now also perhaps as a misguided test of some sort of durability, I'm going to give this sort of whack into this right here. It is not actually a coffee bag. It is a coffee bag, but it's got frozen water in it. It's a block of ice right now. It's actually really good coffee too, so plug for Cameron's Coffee. If you shop at Costco, I prefer the Velvet Moon. But anyway, good old coffee here. I'm going to try and cut into this ice block, see how well the edge holds up. At the moment, it's real good. It's straight. There's no complaints or anything I would say, but I've only cut a pair of pants. So, block of ice, as you can see, lovely, and my hands are cold, so it's tough to tell on the switch. That is still very, very sharp. How sharp is it? I don't have any paper, but it can shave the coffee bag, so there's that. The other bit to note is Sword Friend Arthur noted that the edge was diminished after he cut through a water bottle top, and I'm not 100% sure that that's the case after watching his video. He wasn't exactly sure where the damage happened, and I suspect that it happened when he cut through a TV box, and maybe it hit a staple in one of those boxes. I've dealt with TV boxes a little bit, you might say, and they do have some staples in them. It's certainly possible that he whacked a staple based on what I was seeing in his video, which if you hit a metal piece with a sharp edge, then it's bound to roll it slightly. Now, in fairness, I'm not sure exactly where it happened. It did roll. Maybe it happened on a water bottle top, but I'm not 100% sure. I would suspect that it happened on a staple. The reason I say that is I keened up the edge, which theoretically should make it more brittle, or more fragile, I suppose is the better word. It's much sharper, that edge is more refined, and that edge therefore should be easier to roll. I whacked this relatively refined edge into the tops of water bottles. I whacked it into an ice block, and behind the ice block was a piece of wood, and it's not diminished at all. It's still very, very sharp, very keen after all that testing. So I don't think there's any doubt in terms of the metallurgy or how sturdy the blade is. It seems perfectly effective for the task. I'm not as doubtful about the edge or heat treatment as I was prior to sharpening it and doing some more aggressive testing. All right, sword friends, this has been a long-winded enough review, and I'm going to wrap things up and tell you, do I personally think the sword is worth it or not? The short answer here is no, and there's a couple main factors. First and foremost, I would say, is the elephant in the room, this crack in the saya. Now, the crack seems not just to be on this one, but somewhat common in terms of experiences with cold steel, as noted on the website in Cult of Athena, and as other users have perhaps noted, but that is somewhat hearsay from the internet. Regardless, I think that this is another risk that you might have to take when buying cold steel that you shouldn't have to. Now, in fairness, Cold Steel has not had an opportunity to fix it. I don't believe Sword Friend Arthur reached out to Cold Steel and asked them what they would do. I did reach out to Cold Steel. They said, hey, maybe send it back, and I've been trying to exchange emails with them, but there's a lot going on in the world right now, and the responses have not been terribly quick. Regardless, though, even if Cold Steel were to send a free saya to Arthur that would have fit perfectly out of the box, it's still a phone call that would have had to happen, or a thing that needed to happen that really shouldn't. You shouldn't need to do that to have a sword. More of them should come out good than bad. Maybe that's the case, but I would say that failure should be less common perhaps than they seemingly are. More to the point that I haven't had this experience even buying secondhand swords with Skydro, with Minatoshi, with Ronin Dojo Pro, with Hanwei XL, so the other $300 competition. Most swords seem to be able to come out of the box not broken. Not to say that any of those companies are without flaw or don't have their own potential issues, but they do seem perhaps a little less glaring than this at times. The other thing that I would say is a determining factor is the blade is not terribly sharp out of the box. I noted it's functional for backyard shenanigans that cut bottles-ish sufficiently. It would cut tatami with a lot of chutzpah, and I'm sure it would be fine on like branches or some lighter wood type targets. The point is, though, that it is marketed as a blade sufficient for tamashigiri, and it didn't come with a level of sharpness out of the box that really let me do that. Now, you would argue, or some of you would, that if you're going to own a sword, you should be comfortable sharpening it, and hey, keening up swords is just kind of par for the course. I would argue, however, that the other aforementioned companies that I've said have sold me, and I have had swords from them that out of the box are sharp enough to do the task. So this one seems a little bit duller than the other competition, and out of the box, crack saya, not sufficient to do tamashigiri. Those are two main factors for me. Additionally, one that I would say is a little bit more subjective is the handle didn't come off. They have come off in other Cold Steel products. I had an Emperor Katana where I could take the handle off. This one just isn't budging, and maybe that's a good thing for some people because it does seem very sturdy. For me, I'm going to say it's bad though because I want to be able to take the sword apart and clean it, maintain it, and that's part of the thing. If I'm cutting water bottles and there's a bohi, that water could run down the tang, and I want to be able to clean it off to maintain this sword. Anyway, those are the things that I would say mean to me that this sword is just not a great value. I think your money goes further elsewhere with said aforementioned companies. That said, though, this is not a bad product. It doesn't offer a ton of value and it has a little bit of risk, and I don't think it's terribly competitive. It does have some cool stuff, though. I like the overall aesthetics of the fittings. I like the arrowheads. I like the styling. I like that the Ito is tight. That's something that a lot of those other companies missed and could make for a costly repair later on down the line. So the Ito is sufficient. I wouldn't call it great, but it is better better than perhaps some other swords in the $300 price category. I also like the overall shape of the blade. I like that it has a swelled tip. I like the bohi and how wide it is. I like the crispness of the termination. I like the additional embellishment of the yokote, or rather that okasaki, the big looking tip on the end, even though the polish is pretty simple. That additional detail I think makes for an imposing blade. I like the metal kojiri at the end of the saya. There are some redeeming things that I think could make this sword competitive were it perhaps a little less risky and a little sharper out of the box. The other thing I want to note is that I'm basing these on just this particular sword. My previous experiences with this sword, as I noted, were heavier, and it seems like other people have had heavier swords too, which is another source of variation that gives me some concern. That said, I believe I heard something in some YouTube video of Cold Steel that perhaps they've lightened some of the swords, so maybe this is a more common experience. If it is, I would say that it's certainly more within the realm of people's liking than the previous blades, which were a little bit heavier and felt a little more cumbersome to move around. Anyway, this is not my favorite dynamically to move, but that doesn't mean that other people wouldn't enjoy it. A lot of people like a little more tip-heavy swords. I generally tend to, but for lack of a great explanation, this one just doesn't sing to me. And if it does to you, if there's something about this sword that you really like that sings to you above all others, buy it. It's a durable product. It's fine. There's nothing inherently terrible about it. Obviously, these things could be repaired and are small in the grand scale. It's still a perfectly functional thing, but buy it then. It's durable. It's not a ripoff. It's not a terrible thing. I just think my argument would be your money can go a little further elsewhere and get a product that's similar in functionality and feature set and is less likely to be damaged and more likely to be sharp out of the box. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. If I kind of missing the mark here, is there something glaringly failure-esque about this sword that I've missed, or something redeeming about it that I did not explain? If so, throw it in the commentary down below. I am certainly interested in hearing what all of you think for the 5 of you that are remaining at the end of this video. Anyway, that's all I've got for you. As always, cheers and thanks for watching.